Hello and welcome to Entirely English. And we have a rather interesting history for you to look at today. Before we get started, I want to welcome some new subscribers. First off, we have Andrew Russell. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for joining us. Next, Certain Death. I had to look at that a couple of times before we registered. The next one is either G or, because you've gone lowercase, G. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Then we have Pam Cressman. Thanks for being here, Pam. And we have MM002AAA. So I'm not going to try to pronounce that as one thing. Good to see you here. Thanks for subscribing. And finally, we have Hermine Bouvier. Maybe it's Hermione if it's a different spelling. Thank you for joining us. Do pop some information in the comments. Let us know about you, what you're interested in. If I haven't mentioned your name, it's because YouTube haven't told me. Sometimes they keep it secret for some reason. So again, if you would like to pop your name in below, say subscribed, and tell me about yourself, where you're from, what you're interested in. Okay, on to today's video. Household recycling. This became law in Britain in 2003. And today we have dozens of different methods of complying with this law. We sort our food waste, our cardboard, our glass, our plastics, all separated, garden waste as well, all separated into different bins and collected by the council. And what you might find surprising is we do this willingly. Why? Let's be honest, it's a lot of hassle. We manage separate home systems, and then there's all the council composting bags and collections. In the streets, we even have bins which separate litter from glass, from paper. But we do it. And we tell ourselves it's because we are the first generation that cares. We care for the environment. We assume this is a 21st century phenomenon. But Britain has been doing its bit for recycling for centuries. It's absolutely no new thing for the British. In fact, the idea of throwing an object away after using it just once is a weird modern blip in our history. Long before big corporations and the government got involved, every British home was running a nearly flawless zero waste economy. If we go back to just the 70s, 80s, and 90s and look at who was running the recycling systems at that time, you won't find multinational waste companies. You won't find the government or the local councils involved at all. You'll find groups of ordinary people who actually cared. And back then, at the end of the last century, local councils explicitly refused to separate recycling from the general rubbish. Their solution to waste was simply to gather all of it together and drop it in a big hole in the ground. Often these places where quarries had been used up, and they filled the ground with waste and then covered it with topsoil and often built homes on top of it. But we had these grassroots pioneers who looked at this country addicted to landfill and said, we'll fix that. We'll fix it ourselves. These are groups like the Community Recycling Network, the Avon Friends of the Earth, and other local people in smaller communities who did this. These were the architects of the modern green movement. They went out, they bought old decommissioned milk floats, knocked on doors, handed out the first UK recycling boxes or bags, and they spent weekends manually sorting glass bottles, tying up heavy bundles of newspapers in church halls, community centres, anywhere they could use, any space they could get. They didn't make a profit. Every penny they got went back into developing the system. But then in the late 1990s, the government suddenly realized that the European Union were in the process of instigating massive fines against the use of landfill. And thus, doorstep recycling was about to become mandatory. And the moment it became legally mandated, it was no longer a community chore, it was a multi-million pound industrial asset. Massive private waste corporations swooped in with their megabooks, snapped up the lucrative new council contracts, and systematically squeezed out the grassroots community groups who had spent decades proving the system worked. The community spirit was commodified. But this doesn't explain why the British public was so willing to accept these recycling boxes and recycling bags in the first place. And the reason for this is that for generations, the British household was already part of a massive, silent, circular economy. Now let's take a prime example, the traditional British milk round. You possibly have heard of this or seen it in old films if you watch old films or old television shows. In 1975, a staggering 94% of all milk in the UK was delivered to the doorstep in glass bottles. It was a masterpiece of logistics. You drank the milk, you rinsed the bottle, you put it out on the doorstep, the milkman came, dropped off new milk and took the empty bottles away. And those bottles weren't rubbish. A single glass bottle was rinsed, sterilized, refilled and sent back out with milk in it an average of 25 times before it had to go to the cullet. We'll come to cullet in a moment. Unfortunately, by the 1990s, the supermarket had essentially killed off the milk round, the milkman. And at that time, milk was provided in cardboard boxes. It was a lot cheaper than the milk that was delivered. People were at that time getting used to going to town quite frequently to buy their stuff. So it was cheaper to buy milk at the supermarket. That killed the industry there. Nowadays, those cardboard boxes have been replaced by these plastic ones. And we all know about microplastic, etc. Those plastic bottles are destroyed immediately afterwards and not recycled, reused, maybe ground down. That's a whole different thing. But let's look back at that. I mentioned cullets before. Now, glass bottles are not immortal. As I said, the milk ones were used maybe 25 times before some damage would occur. These damaged, broken bottles were sold by the ton to independent scrap glass dealers called cullet merchants. And those merchants would hire teenagers, often at the weekend, and they had fun with these bottles, throwing them against brick walls, smashing them to smithereens. And breaking the glass up like this was very useful because you could get a lot more broken glass into a truck than you can bottles. And also melting down those shards of glass requires a lot less heat, a lot less money. The scrapings were gathered up by the cullet merchant and taken to the glassworks in northern England to be remelted and reused. But we need to go deeper, because long before the 1950s milk rounds, before the 1980s green volunteers, British recycling was driven by something else: pure, raw survival. And be warned, some of what we're going to discuss next is pretty yucky. So for centuries, if an item held even the most minute, microscopic amount of chemical or physical value, an industry formed around collecting it, such as the Shoddy Mills of Yorkshire. In 1813, Benjamin Law invented a process to grind down old rags to create wool. And this was a massive, dirty, loud recycling industry run and supplied by our rag and bone men long before our modern era of recycling. So our ancestors, they didn't have plastics like we do, so they recycled the elements. Because if you were a peasant and you lived on a lord's land, you couldn't collect the wood, the broken branches, or heaven forbid, chop down a tree on the lord's land, because that belonged to the lord and you could be imprisoned or executed for it. So what they did was they collected the cow pats, those little circular things the cows leave behind on the field, dried them out and burned them in their fires. And consider the Victorian gatherer of the pure. The pure is a polite euphemistic name for what dogs leave in the street, or used to leave in the street. Scavengers of London, often kids, would spend their entire day walking the streets of London, for example, gathering these droppings into buckets. But why? To burn in the fire? No. The reason being, dog poo is highly alkaline, and they sold what they collected by the pound to the local leather tanneries, like in Bermondsey, where it was used to soften, purify, and prep expensive leather for luxury book bindings. If you think that's bad, what about the bucket and cloak man? In the 18th, 19th century, in fact earlier, as well. There were these entrepreneurs who would stand in the streets of London or any major city with a bucket or a barrel, and they would wear a long, heavy cloak. And if a gentleman, lady even, on the street paid them a farthing, the cloakman would stand with his cloak held out as a shield, screen, so that person could use the bucket or barrel as a toilet. Okay, so we've got a kind of public convenience there before we had public conveniences, but actually it goes further than that, because while this cloak and bucket man was paid a farthing for the use of the barrel, he would then, when it was filled, take all of that urine, which was known as land, and take it to a place that stored it and ferment it into a high ammonia soup. And all of this stuff was put into massive barrels, sealed up, and shipped to the Scottish Highlands, because sheep's wool is coated in thick, greasy lanolin, and ammonia is a strong natural degreaser. So all these barrels of the waste from London went to Scotland, and then the wool was soaked in this urine, this ammonia soup, to remove the lanolin. But that's not all. Then we have the Waulking group of local women. Waulking, not like walking, W-A-U-L-K, Waulking. Now, these women would sit around a large wooden table, and they would pour the warm, fermented urine. The warm thing makes it even more gross, doesn't it? Warm, fermented urine over the newly woven tweed, and rhythmically pound and knead the fabric to thicken it and lock in the natural plant dyes. So the iconic Harris tweed was literally birthed from human waste. And if I can find it, I'll upload here the traditional Waulking song that women would sing while doing this. How they could sing and breathe in that smell, I don't know. But now, there is a famous old story that the ships carrying these heavy barrels of urine out of the English ports down the Thames to the sea to be taken to Scotland would lie about their cargo, because the captains were embarrassed about transporting urine. And it said that when a dock worker got close and they smelled what was coming out of the barrel, realized they weren't transporting wine, they'd say, "You're taking the piss." Sadly, that's not where that phrase comes from, but it's a nice story. Anyway, let's continue. So our city streets, let's focus on London. It's easier to focus on. The streets of London were just the surface, literally. Beneath the streets of London lay an entire recycling network. And here we meet the Tosher, or the sewer hunters. These brave, desperate men and boys navigated the toxic, pitch black, slippy, slimy labyrinth of London's sewage system. Armed with a lantern and a long pole with a claw on the end, they walked through these sewers, scavenging for dropped coins, silver cutlery, jewellery, anything that had obvious value like that, but even scrap metal or bits of rope that had washed down from the street above. These things were all recycled, repurposed, sold, traded. Meanwhile, back on the surface, many of the homes, this is before they had flushing toilets, had cesspits. A cesspit is like a container that stored all of the human waste. They're generally porous, and the liquid would filter out into the ground, and you were left with the solids in this container. Enter the nightmen. In the dead of night, these workers arrived with horse-drawn carts to manually shovel out the human waste, which was euphemistically called night soil. They didn't dump it. They were paid for collecting it, and then they sold it to the farmers on the outskirts of the city. So the food that was consumed in the city was grown with the recycled waste from the city. And then we have the muddy banks of the River Thames. Where the sewers met the rivers, you had the Mudlarks. These were often impoverished children, orphans, etc. And these young scavengers braved the mud of the River Thames. This was at low tide. When the river was low, they'd walk along the mud looking for bits of coal Just like the Toshers, they were looking for iron, any jewelry or coins that had been lost. They were basically an essential salvage recovery operation. They collected lumps of coal that had fallen off the barges transporting it down the Thames, copper, metal bolts that could be sold to ironworks, bones that could be sold to glue factories. But they were taking their life in their hands because that mud could hold on to them and they could be stuck there, they could sink in it and drown when the tide came in. So it's very dangerous. But it was essentially recycling, finding things that could be used again. I think the word dustman, we did a video on dustbin men before. Here we go. Did you ever stop to wonder why we call them dustmen and dustbins? Nowadays, we don't put dust in our bins, do we? Maybe like emptying the vacuum cleaner bag is as dusty as we get it. But in the 19th century, your bin was literally full of dust, specifically coal ash and cinders from your fire. So this waste in your home was collected because for industry, this was an absolute gold mine. Private contractors hired men to drive carts around and they'd ring a bell shouting, "Dusto, Dusto," and they took your household waste to sprawling dust yards. And in those dust yards, armies of women and children again, their faces entirely black with soot, breathing in this soot all day long, they would manually sift through the waste. They pulled out any bits of rag for paper mills, bones again for the glue factories, metal, nails and things for the smithing. But the real prize was the ash itself. This was sold by the thousands of tons to the local brickworks on the edge of the growing cities. They mixed this household fireplace dust into the clay to bake bricks. That means many of those iconic brick terraces in London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc., were quite literally built out of the household waste of people who lived in earlier houses. It was a perfect industrial circular economy. Nothing was lost. But to find real origins of this recycling, reusing mentality, we have to go back even further. Thousands of years, the people of this island survived by treating materials as finite, precious assets. Well, let's look back at the time of the Romans in Britain. If one of their expensive imported earthenware vases or urns was broken, it wasn't discarded. If it couldn't be repaired by a craftsman, it was completely ground down into a fine powder and then mixed with building mortar to make it waterproof. Archaeological excavations of a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall revealed that shipping barrels of wine and olives, when they'd been emptied, weren't destroyed, weren't burned. They were systematically taken apart, dismantled, and the wooden staves were reshaped to form floorboards, window frames, and other useful items. And just like we discussed before with our milk bottles, etc., the Romans did this too. Making brand new glass from raw silica requires staggering amounts of heat, and that requires huge amounts of wood fuel and coal, of course. So the Roman Britons ran a very sophisticated glass recycling network. Broken window glass, perfume bottles, drinking glasses were collected together by urban scavengers, smashed up just like we've discussed already, and melted down in the local cullet ovens and cast and blown into whole new objects. This recycling loop was so extensive that centuries after the Romans left, Anglo-Saxon glassmakers were still melting down old Roman glass to make their own products. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the shipping lanes closed and metal productivity ground to a halt. So the population that remained on Britain survived for the next 300 years by recycling the ruins around them. They stripped the lead pipes out of the Roman baths, they melted down bronze statues, and pulled iron nails out of the decaying Roman villas to reforge them into knives, swords, and plowshares. So this modern idea of throwing something away after a single use is completely alien to what is essentially in our DNA, what we have been programmed with over thousands of years. So whether it was a Roman soldier reshaping an old wine barrel or a medieval peasant gathering cowpats to burn as winter fuel, recycling wasn't an environmental lifestyle choice. It was a way to survive. So when the British government passed that law in 2003, telling us we had to start sorting our rubbish, Britain was already well prepared mentally for this shift. We really didn't need a piece of legislation to teach us how to value waste. It's in our DNA. It's in our vocabulary, our architecture, our history. We just exchanged gathering the pure and fermenting urine into plastic bottle cartons and flattening cardboard boxes. We're not the first generation to recycle. We're just the latest chapter in a long, brilliant, and sometimes incredibly yucky British tradition. So next time you're standing in the kitchen grumbling and arguing over which colour bin the pizza box goes in, just remember, it could be a whole lot yuckier. Probably you have similar histories in your countries, particularly in European countries where the Romans came through. They have a big influence on us. Tell me in the comments below how openly your country adopted recycling, or if your country doesn't recycle. What is the problem? Why can't your government get your people to recycle? Also, tell me of any interesting variations that you have for recycling that we possibly don't do here. Do like and subscribe and share and all that sort of thing. Do, as I said, leave a comment about your recycling, your history of these sort of things. And if you're a subscriber and I haven't mentioned your name, pop it in below. And I'll see you again next time. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.